My daughter-in-law once mocked my cooking and laughed. Your time is over. I stayed silent, but her words burned deep inside me. Months later, she stood in line outside New York's most famous restaurant, waiting for a table, unaware of what was coming. She didn't know who owned it until I stepped out of the restaurant. And what happened next left her completely frozen. Before I tell you what happened next, if you're watching this, please hit subscribe to Her Voice. Tell me in the comments which country you're watching from. Hello, friends. My name is Margaret. I am 59 years old, and I live in a small apartment in Brooklyn, New York. For most of my life, I worked in the kitchen. Not some fancy restaurant, but a small family diner my husband and I built from nothing. It was called Henry's Place, named after him. We served old-fashioned meals, the kind people called comfort food, dishes that smelled like home. When Henry passed away 5 years ago, everything changed. The diner felt empty without his laughter, without the way he'd call me Maggie girl when we were closing up late at night. I tried to keep it running on my own, but it was too much. But my son Daniel told me I should sell it and rest. He said I'd worked enough in life. His wife Olivia agreed, but in a way that felt sharp, like she didn't just mean to help me, but to remind me that my chapter was over. I sold the diner, packed the photos, and told myself I'd find peace in the quiet. But peace never came. Every morning, I'd wake up before sunrise out of habit, my hands searching for a pan that wasn't there. Cooking wasn't just work for me. It was my language, my way of loving people. When Daniel and Olivia invited me to dinner a few months later, I hoped it would feel like family again. Olivia had taken charge of the kitchen now. She wore her confidence like perfume, strong and deliberate. While she stirred a sauce, she said with a laugh, "Mom, you still use those old recipes, right? People don't eat like that anymore. Your time is kind of over." She said it like a joke, but why cut straight through me? I smiled like it didn't hurt, but inside it felt like something broke quietly. I watched her serve everyone with that smug little smile, like she was the new queen of the kitchen, and I was just an outdated cookbook left on a dusty shelf. That night when I came home, I sat at the table staring at my hands. These were the same hands that once made pies for charity events, cooked for Henry when he was sick, taught my son how to fry an egg. Suddenly, they looked tired, forgotten, useless. I promised myself right there that I wouldn't let her be right about me. I didn't know how or when, but I knew I would rise again, not to prove her wrong, but to remind myself who I really was. The next morning, I walked to a little coffee shop near the East River. The owner, a kind man named DeLewis, always played old jazz. I sat there with my notebook and started writing down every recipe I remembered from my diner days, the ones people used to love. There were smudges on the pages from my tears, but I kept writing. 2 weeks later, I saw a flyer for a culinary workshop downtown. It was for modernizing traditional dishes. Something about that line spoke to me. I used the last bit of my savings to join. When I walked in that first day, everyone was young, full of energy and ideas. I felt out of place, like a grandmother at a college party. But then the instructor, Chef Lila, tasted my sample dish, an old-fashioned chicken pot pie, and said softly, "You have magic in your hands. You just forgot what it felt like." That moment changed me. I started learning again. I learned plating, flavor balance, new cooking methods, but most of all, I learned to believe that experience is not weakness, it's power wrapped in patience. I began cooking for small community events, slowly gaining confidence. People loved the warmth in my food. They said it tasted like memories. One night, as I was cleaning up after a charity dinner, a man named Ethan approached me. He was a restaurant investor, much younger than me, but sharp and kind. He said, "You should open your own place, something that feels like your story. I laughed it off at first, but he wasn't joking. He believed in my vision when I had forgotten it myself. Over the next few months, we met often, sharing ideas over coffee, creating menus inspired by my late husband's favorite dishes. That's how Margaret's Table was born, not just as a restaurant, but as a heartbeat brought back to life. I could already picture it. Warm lights, old jazz, wooden tables, the kind of place that made people breathe slower and feel safe. But deep inside, I also imagined one thing I'd never admit out loud. I wanted Olivia to see it someday, to stand there and realize what she had thrown away with her cruel words, not out of hate, but because sometimes silence deserves an echo. I was no longer the woman she mocked. I was becoming someone new, someone she would never expect. The first months were harder than anything I'd ever faced. Finding a location in Manhattan felt impossible. Every decent space was either too expensive or too small. I spent days walking the streets, notebook in hand, writing down addresses and imagining what each place could become. One cold afternoon, I found a narrow old brick building tucked between two boutiques on Bleecker Street. It had cracked windows, peeling paint, and a faint smell of dust and garlic. But when I stepped inside, I could almost hear the hum of a kitchen, the rhythm of knives against wood, the soft music of people laughing over dinner. I knew right then that this broken place would be mine. Ethan handled the paperwork, but I did everything else myself. I scrubbed the floors until my hands ached, painted the walls a deep warm cream, and picked every plate and chair with a kind of care only someone who's loved and lost can understand. Some nights I'd sit alone in the half-finished dining room with a cup of tea, imagining the people who would one day sit there. I thought about Henry, about how proud he'd be. And sometimes I thought about Olivia, her perfect smile, her cutting. Wasn't revenge that fueled me anymore. It was purpose. I wanted to create a place that reminded people of love, of kindness, of the kind of meals that hold stories in their flavor. When the opening day finally came, I barely slept the night before. We called it Margaret's Table because that's what it truly was. My table, my story, my comeback. The morning light poured through the front windows as I tied on my apron. There were only 6 tables, and I worried no one would come. But within an hour, people started arriving. A couple from Boston who had read about us online, a young woman who said her grandmother used to cook like me, even a few curious locals who peeked in just to see what was happening. The first dish I served was the same chicken pot pie that Olivia had once mocked. I made it slow, careful, and full of memory. When the woman at table 3 took a bite and closed her eyes with a smile, I felt something break open inside me, not pain, but peace. Word spread faster than I ever expected. People talked about the warmth of the place, how it felt like home, even if they'd never been there before. Food critics began showing up, writing about how Margaret's Table brings heart back to Manhattan. Within months, we had a waiting list every night. I didn't even have time to think about success. I was just trying to keep up with the joy of it all. Ethan would laugh and say, "You know you're famous now, right?" But I didn't care about fame. I cared about the people who walked out smiling. I cared about the young cooks who worked with me and called me mom. Late one evening after closing, I was wiping down the counter when I saw something that stopped me cold. It was an online review written under the name Olivia P. She hadn't written anything cruel, just a single line. I heard this place was started by an older woman. Maybe I should visit. My heart skipped a beat. I didn't know if she realized was me. I didn't know if it was curiosity, guilt, or pride that made her write it. But deep down, I knew one day she would come. That thought stayed with me every morning as I walked into my restaurant. Every scent of roasted herbs, every hum of chatter, every sound of laughter reminded me how far I had come from that night. She called me outdated. I had built something alive again, something honest. And though I pretended not to care, part of me waited for that door to open and see her standing there. Because sometimes the sweetest revenge isn't planned. It's the quiet satisfaction of being exactly where they said you never could be. It was a rainy Friday evening when it finally happened. The restaurant was packed as usual, the air filled with the smell of roasted garlic, thyme, and slow cooked chicken. I was in the kitchen plating the last few dishes when Ethan came in quietly and said, "Margaret, there's someone asking about you at the front, says she knows you." I wiped my hands on my apron and walked toward the door, my heart beating in that strange, uneven rhythm that only happens when the past suddenly stands too close. And there she was, Olivia, standing by the host stand, shaking the rain off her coat, her hair pulled back in that perfect way she always liked. She looked a little thinner, a little older, but her confidence was still there. Behind her stood Daniel, my son, looking uncomfortable, his hands shoved into his pockets. I froze for a second, and so did she. Our eyes met, and for a moment, I could see the exact second she realized who I was. Her lips parted slightly, and that polite smile she wore flickered. She whispered, "Mom." I smiled softly and nodded. "Welcome to Margaret's table." She didn't speak, neither did Daniel. The host guided them to a table near the window, the one with the best view of the streetlights. I walked back to the kitchen, my mind spinning, but my face calm. Ethan looked at me and whispered, "Is that her?" I nodded. He didn't ask more. I told the staff I would personally prepare the next order for that table. My hands didn't shake as I started cooking. I made the same dish she had once mocked, my chicken pot pie, but this time I made it with a kind of grace I never had before. Every fold of dough, every brush of butter, every pinch of salt felt like a piece of my story coming together. I sent the dish out myself. When I reached their table, they both looked up. Daniel smiled faintly, but Olivia kept staring at the food. I placed the plate down and said quietly, "This one's on the house." She nodded, her throat tight, her eyes glistening, but refusing to break. I didn't stay to watch them eat. I walked back to the kitchen, poured myself a cup of tea, and stood by the window. But I didn't need to see her reaction. I could feel it. There's a certain silence that comes when guilt meets memory. It's louder than words. After a few minutes, I heard footsteps behind me. I turned around and saw Olivia standing there holding her coat in her arms. Her voice was low when she said, "I didn't know this was yours." I smiled and said, "I know." She hesitated, then added, "It's beautiful. And the food, it's everything I never appreciated before." For a second, I saw the same young woman I once believed in before ego turned her cruel. I didn't say much, just nodded and said, "Everyone finds their way back to the table eventually." She looked down, then whispered, "I'm sorry." I could tell it wasn't just about that night years ago, but about everything. The distance, the coldness, the pride. I wanted to tell her I forgave her right then, but something inside me said it wasn't time yet. Forgiveness needs to bloom naturally, not forced. So I just smiled and said, "Take care of my son. That's all I ask." She nodded, left quietly. I stood there watching her go, not with anger or triumph, but with a strange peace that wrapped around me like a soft blanket. That night, when I closed the restaurant, I sat alone at table 3 and thought about how life circles back in its own mysterious way. Revenge had never been my goal. What I wanted was dignity, to reclaim the part of me she tried to erase. And I had done that, not through shouting, not through bitterness, but through creation, patience, and love for what I do. That was my true victory. The next few weeks felt like living inside a quiet miracle, watching everything I once dreamed of slowly take shape. My restaurant, Margaret's Table, was becoming the talk of New York. People loved how it felt like home, how every dish carried warmth and memory. They said it reminded them of their mothers, of family dinners filled with love instead of noise. I smiled whenever I heard that because that was exactly what I wanted, to make food that healed hearts. One morning, as I sat by the front window, sunlight spilling across the tables, I saw her, Olivia. She was walking down the street in her perfect heels, her hair neat, her eyes sharp but tired. She did not notice me at first, but then she looked up and froze. Her gaze moved from the signboard to the window and then to me. I could see the disbelief on her face, the same woman who once laughed at my cooking, now standing outside a restaurant named after me. For a long moment, she just stood there, unsure what to do. Then she pulled out her phone, probably to call Daniel. I stayed still, pretending not to notice, though. Inside my chest, my heart was calm, not bitter, just full. A few hours later, my server whispered that someone wanted to see me. When Olivia walked in, the whole room seemed to pause. She looked around quietly, taking in every detail, every customer who smiled as they ate the food she once mocked. "This place is yours," she said softly. "Yes," I replied. She glanced around again, her voice trembling a little. "It is beautiful." I thanked her and offered her a seat, but she said maybe another time and walked out, her reflection trembling in the glass door as she left. That evening, Daniel came too. He did not come inside, wondering. He just stood outside for a long time, watching through the window. I could see the look on his face, something between pride and regret. When I stepped out to walk up, he spoke quietly. "You have done well, Margaret. Better than I ever thought you could." I looked at him, not angry anymore, just calm. "You never thought because you never believed," I said. He nodded slowly, and for the first time, he had nothing to say. That night, when I turned off the lights and looked at the empty tables, I did not feel revenge burning in me. I felt peace, the kind that comes when life answers for you without you having to speak. That night, I barely slept. The sound of the city outside felt softer than usual, almost kind. I lay there thinking about how far I had come, how a few cruel words had once pushed me into silence, and how that same silence had turned into power. I did not plan revenge. I just built something that spoke for me. The next morning, when I arrived at the restaurant, there was already a small crowd waiting. A food blogger had posted about Margaret's Table, and overnight we had gone viral. People wanted to know who this older woman was who cooked with such heart. I smiled as I read the comments. Some said the food reminded them of Sunday mornings with their grandmother. Others said they could taste love in every bite. That day, a man in a gray suit came to my office, introducing himself as a representative from a major network. He said they wanted to feature me in a segment about women who started over after 50. I almost laughed because I never thought anyone would care about my story. But he looked at me sincerely and said, "People need to see this kind of strength." I agreed to it, though a small part of me wondered how Olivia would feel seeing me on television. The segment aired a week later. The night it played, I sat alone in my living room, watching my younger self flash across the screen as I spoke about losing everything, finding courage, and building again. When it ended, my phone lit up with messages, even from old friends I had not spoken to in years. Among them was one from Daniel. He wrote that he was proud of me, that he was sorry for not standing by me when I needed him. I stared at that message for a long time before replying. I told him I forgave him, not because he asked, but because I was finally free. The next day, Olivia came again. This time she did not wear heels. She looked different, quieter, as if life had taken something from her. She asked if we could talk privately. I took her to my office. She sat down and looked at the floor for a while before speaking. She said things had not been easy, that the business Daniel started had failed and they were struggling. I listened silently as she spoke, tears building in her eyes. Then she said something that surprised me. She asked if I would consider hiring her even part-time just until they got back on their feet. I looked at her and for a moment I saw the same proud woman who once mocked me, but this time her pride was gone. I could have said no. I could have turned her pain into my victory, but instead I said yes. She stared at me as if she could not believe it. I told her that sometimes the sweetest revenge is kindness, especially when the world expects you to hate. When she left my office that day, I felt something lift inside me, as if the last piece of bitterness had finally faded. The next morning, Olivia showed up right on time. She wore a plain shirt and jeans, no designer bag, no painted smile, just a quiet expression that carried a kind of tired grace. I greeted her with a nod and handed her an apron. She looked unsure of what to do, but I gently told her to start by setting the tables and learning how things worked. Watching her move around my restaurant felt strange at first. This was the same woman who once told me I was outdated, that my time was over, and now she was working under my roof. But instead of feeling triumph, I felt a kind of ache deep inside. Sometimes victory doesn't taste as sweet as you imagine it will. Still, I stayed professional. I showed her how we folded napkins, where we kept the spices, how every table must feel like a small story waiting to be told. The other staff treated her kindly, though I could sense their curiosity. They whispered sometimes, wondering who she really was, but I never explained. I wanted her to find her own place here, not through pity, but through effort. A few weeks passed and I began to notice something changing in her. She worked quietly, never complained, and for the first time, she seemed humble. One afternoon, she asked if she could help in the kitchen. I hesitated, but agreed. When I handed her a knife to chop onions, she smiled nervously. Her hands were shaky, her pace slow, but she tried. The smell of sauteed garlic filled the room. And I saw her close her eyes as if remembering something from long ago. She whispered that she used to cook with her mother before life got too busy, before she forgot what real food smelled like. For a moment, the air between us softened. That night, after the restaurant closed, she came to my office and thanked me for giving her a chance. She said she had never respected how much work it took to build something from nothing. Her words were honest, and I could see a new kind of light in her eyes, one that wasn't built on pride, but on gratitude. A few days later, Daniel came to see her. He looked older, worn out, carrying the same weight of regret I had seen before. When he saw me, he hesitated, then nodded. We spoke briefly about business, about the restaurant's growth, and then he left quietly. Later that night, Olivia told me they were thinking about moving back into a smaller place, starting over. She said life had a way of humbling people and that maybe losing everything had been the best thing that ever happened to her. I nodded, understanding more than she knew. The following week, a restaurant was invited to cater a charity event in Manhattan. It was a big opportunity, and I decided to take Olivia with me. She looked nervous, but I told her she would do fine. The event was grand, filled with lights, cameras, and influential guests. When people asked to meet the woman behind the food, I stepped forward and introduced myself while Olivia stood beside me watching with quiet admiration. At the end of the night, she pulled me aside and said softly that she was proud of me, that she finally understood why people loved my cooking. I smiled and told her that love was the secret ingredient, always had been. On the drive back, she looked out of the window and said she wished she could go back and change how she treated me. I told her not to dwell on the past, that sometimes remorse itself is enough of a punishment. She nodded and tears ran down her cheeks. That moment felt like the final page of a long, painful chapter, closing softly without bitterness. When we returned to the restaurant that night, I unlocked the door, looked around, and felt something shift inside me. The woman who once felt invisible had become someone whose voice mattered, whose hands built something lasting. And the woman who once mocked me had now found her humility working beside me. That was my quiet revenge, not loud or cruel, but gentle and complete. I went home, brewed a cup of tea, and stood by the window watching the city lights shimmer. For the first time in years, I felt whole, not because I won, but because I healed. A few weeks passed and life settled into a rhythm that felt almost peaceful. Olivia came to work every morning before I did, opening the blinds, checking the coffee machines, and greeting the staff with a soft smile. There was no trace of the arrogance she once carried. She had changed, not in words, but in the quiet way she moved and the care she put into every small task. I watched her sometimes from my office window, wondering if time really was the greatest teacher after all. One afternoon, I decided to take her with me to the farmer's market on the edge of the city. It was a crisp Saturday morning, the kind where the air smells of fresh bread and roasted nuts. We walked together, picking out vegetables, talking about recipes. And for the first time in years, it didn't feel heavy between us. At one stall, she picked up a bunch of tomatoes and said they reminded her of the stew I used to make when she first married Daniel. I was surprised she remembered. That she smiled a little and said that back then she had been too proud to admit that confession broke something open in me. Maybe forgiveness isn't one grand gesture, but a collection of small, honest moments like that. When we got back to the restaurant, I asked her to cook with me. The kitchen filled with the rhythm of chopping and stirring, the smell of herbs, the warmth of two women finally finding peace after years of cold distance. When the stew was done, I handed her a spoon to taste. She took a small bite, looked up, and whispered that it was perfect. That night, after closing, she stayed behind to help me clean. We talked for hours about life, about the choices we make and the regrets we carry. She told me she had always felt she needed to prove something, to show she was better than me, because deep down she feared being. I told her being ordinary wasn't a weakness, that real strength comes from kindness and humility. She nodded, her eyes glossy, and said she wished she had learned that sooner. The next morning, a food critic came in unannounced. He was well known, the kind whose review could change everything. We served him our best dishes, and Olivia helped in the kitchen with precision and care. When he finished eating, he asked to meet the owner. I walked out to greet him, and Olivia followed, standing just behind me. He smiled, said the food was exquisite, full of soul, and that it was rare to find a place where you could taste emotion in every bite. That night, his review went live, calling Margaret's Table a hidden gem that reminded people of love and resilience. We received more reservations than we could handle. The restaurant became busier, louder, brighter. Through it all, Olivia stayed steady, never once acting like she deserved credit. I started trusting her with more responsibilities, and she never disappointed me. One evening, she told me she wanted to go back to school to study culinary arts to learn properly what she had once dismissed. I smiled and offered to help pay her tuition. She shook her head and said no. She wanted to earn it herself. That made me proud in a way I can't describe. Daniel came by later that week looking lighter than before. He thanked me for helping Olivia and said their marriage was healing, that they were learning to talk again without anger. Hearing that felt like closure, like the universe tying up a loose end with quiet grace. After they left, I sat alone at one of the empty tables, the faint hum of the city outside, the scent of garlic still lingering in the air. I thought about how revenge had started as a spark of pain inside me, but had transformed into something beautiful, something that rebuilt lives instead of destroying them. My silence had once been my wound, but now it was my strength. As I locked up that night, I ran my hand across the doorframe, feeling the smooth wood beneath my fingers, and whispered a small prayer of gratitude. Life has a strange way of turning pain into purpose if you let it. Winter came early that year. The air outside turned sharp, the streets dressed in quiet frost, and every evening the windows of Margaret's table glowed warm against the cold. The restaurant had become more than just a place to eat. It was a home for stories, for people searching for comfort, for second chances. Olivia had grown into her role beautifully. She was no longer the unsure woman who first walked through my door. She had found her rhythm. She handled customers with grace, guided the younger staff, and even started creating small dishes of her own. I would watch her sometimes from across the kitchen, noticing how focused she became, how she poured care into everything she touched. One night after closing, she brought me a small bowl of soup she had made herself. It smelled of thyme and roasted vegetables. She looked nervous as she waited for me to taste it. I took one spoonful, then another, and smiled. It was simple, honest, and full of warmth. She exhaled like she had been holding her breath for hours. I told her it was beautiful, not just because of the flavor, but because it came from her heart. That night, she stayed a little longer, helping me wipe down the counters. We didn't talk much, just shared a quiet rhythm. Two women who had walked through the storm and somehow found peace on the other side. A few days later, the first heavy snow of the season fell. The city slowed down and most people stayed inside, but we stayed open, offering hot meals to anyone who came in cold. Around noon, an old man entered shivering in a worn coat. Olivia immediately brought him tea and a bowl of soup. He smiled, thanked her, and told her she reminded him of his late wife. I watched her lean down, listening to him kindly, her eyes soft. There was something healing about that moment. Later that evening, after the rush, she came to me with a question that surprised me. She asked if I would consider opening a second branch someday, maybe in Brooklyn, somewhere smaller, but with the same heart. I looked at her, seeing not the woman who once mocked me, but a partner, someone who truly cared. I told her maybe if the time felt right. Her smile that night was genuine, the kind that came from pride and purpose, not ego. Then one evening, something unexpected happened. A TV producer who had dined with us months ago returned, this time with a camera crew. He told us they were filming a special on local restaurants that inspired change. He wanted to feature us again, but this time he wanted both of us, me and Olivia. I hesitated at first, but Olivia encouraged it. She said maybe people needed to see that even broken relationships can heal. We agreed, and the filming began the next week. They captured everything from our morning prep to the laughter of customers. At one point, they asked Olivia to speak about her journey. She looked into the camera, her voice steady. and said that life had taught her humility in the most unexpected way, that she had once looked down on someone who ended up teaching her the greatest lessons about love, forgiveness, and strength. When she finished, there wasn't a dry eye in the room. The episode aired a few weeks later, and the response was overwhelming. People wrote letters, emails, and comments about how our story gave them hope, how it reminded them to make peace with their own mothers, sisters, or the restaurant's phone never stopped ringing. But beyond the fame, what mattered most to me was that people understood the truth, that kindness could be stronger than revenge, that forgiveness could taste sweeter than hate. A few nights after the episode aired, Olivia invited me to dinner at her apartment. It was the first time she had ever cooked for me. When I arrived, she had set the table beautifully, candles flickering, soft music playing. She served me pasta and bread she had made from scratch. As I took my first bite, I felt a tear sting my eyes. It was delicious. She laughed softly and said she learned from the best. We talked for hours that night about everything we had both lost and gained, about family, time, and second chances. Before I left, she hugged me tightly and whispered, "Thank you for not giving up on me." I told her that sometimes people just need one person to believe they can change. When I got home, I sat by the window with a cup of tea, watching the snow fall outside. The city was quiet, almost peaceful. I thought about how life had come full circle. The woman who once tore me down now stood beside me, helping me build something even stronger. I realized that true revenge had never been about hurting her. It had been about showing her who I really was and letting her see herself through my strength. That night, as I looked out over the city lights, I whispered to myself that my time was never over. It had just begun. And for the first time in my life, I felt proud not just of what I had achieved, but of the grace it took to get there. Spring arrived softly that year, melting the last traces of winter from the city. The trees along the streets near Margaret's table began to bloom, their pale pink petals floating in the wind like small promises of new beginnings. The restaurant felt different too, lighter, happier, almost alive. We had more customers than ever before, but there was no chaos, no stress. Everyone moved together with quiet harmony, as if each person knew their purpose. Olivia had grown into a woman I barely recognized from before. She laughed more now, not that sharp kind of laugh she used to have, but the gentle one that comes from peace. One morning I arrived early and found her sitting by the window, sipping coffee and writing in a small notebook. When I asked what she was doing, she smiled and said she was working on recipes. I nodded, feeling something warm in my chest. To see her care so deeply about food, about the same thing she once mocked, was a full circle moment I never thought I would live to see. A few days later, we received an invitation from a culinary magazine in California. They wanted to feature Margaret's Table as part of a special edition on inspirational restaurants run by women over 50. I was touched by the offer, but what moved me even more was when they asked if Olivia could be part of the story too. I looked at her and saw her eyes light up like a child. She had earned it. We spent the next few days preparing for the visit, making sure every detail reflected the soul of what we had built. On the day of the interview, the photographer asked us to stand together in front of the restaurant sign. The light was soft. The wind carried the smell of fresh bread from the kitchen. And as the camera clicked, I realized this photo wasn't just about success. It was about redemption. That evening, as we sat in my office after everyone left, Olivia told me something that took me by surprise. She said that she and Daniel were expecting their first child. For a moment, I just stared at her, unable to speak. She looked nervous, waiting for my reaction. And then I reached across the table and took her hand. I told her that maybe life was giving us another chance, not to fix the past, but to start a new story. Tears filled her eyes, and she whispered that she wanted her child to grow up knowing the kind of love and patience she had once failed to give. Hearing those words made my heart ache in the best way possible. The following months were filled with change. Olivia's belly grew, and with it, her calmness deepened. She continued to work until her doctor told her to rest. The day she stopped coming in, the restaurant felt emptier. The staff missed her laugh, the sound of her humming while she wiped tables, the small notes she left for everyone with words of encouragement. I visited her often, bringing food and checking in on her. Each time she thanked me with that same grateful smile. One evening, she told me she was scared about being a mother, afraid she would make the same mistakes she made before. I told her that the fact she feared it meant she never would. When the baby finally arrived, Daniel called me first. His voice was full of emotion. He said Olivia wanted me to come to the hospital before anyone else. I went as fast as I could, my heart racing like it hadn't in years. When I entered the room, Olivia was holding a small bundle wrapped in white. She looked up, her eyes tired but shining, and said she wanted me to meet her daughter. As she placed that tiny baby in my arms, I felt a rush of love so strong it took my breath away. Olivia whispered that she named her Margaret because she wanted her daughter to grow up strong, brave, and kind like the woman who taught her what those words truly meant. I couldn't hold back my tears. I kissed the baby's forehead and whispered a silent prayer for her life. Over the next few weeks, I found myself visiting more often, helping Olivia when she needed rest, holding little Margaret while she slept. It felt as if life had handed me back everything I had lost, just in a different form. My son and his wife had once pushed me out, but now they pulled me close. There were moments when I'd sit quietly watching Olivia with her daughter and feel a deep peace in my heart. The pain that once lived in me had turned into something softer, something like grace. One sunny afternoon, Olivia brought the baby to the restaurant for the first time. Everyone gathered around. Everyone gathered around, smiling and cooing at her. I watched them from across the room, feeling the weight of all the years lift. The air was filled with laughter and warmth, and for the first time, I realized that forgiveness had not just healed me, it had healed all of us. When Olivia handed me the baby before leaving, she said softly that she wanted her daughter to know that strength isn't about pride, it's about kindness. I smiled, holding the baby close, and whispered that she already would. That night, after the restaurant closed, I stood by the window looking out at the glowing streetlights. I thought about everything that had happened, from the moment I was mocked for my cooking to standing here surrounded by love and purpose. I had dreamed of revenge once, but what I got instead was something deeper. I didn't destroy the people who hurt me. I helped them rebuild. And in that, I found the truest victory. That night, I sat by my bedroom window watching the lights of the city flicker against the dark sky. It felt strange how peaceful it looked when my heart was anything but calm. Every step I had taken, every moment of silence I had endured had brought me here. I never imagined my life would circle back this way, where the same people who once laughed at me would now look at me with quiet respect. But still, there was a part of me that carried the weight of those old wounds. I kept thinking about Olivia and Daniel, about how things had turned out. Revenge was never my plan. I just wanted to prove to myself that my worth didn't end when they stopped believing in me. Yet somewhere along the way, the pain I once buried turned into purpose. And that purpose gave me everything I had now. Every morning, I wake up before sunrise, brew my coffee, and walk through the restaurant before anyone else arrives. I touch the wooden tables, the chairs, the counters, and I remember the woman who once thought her best days were behind her. Now my mornings are filled with the smell of fresh bread and roasted garlic with the sound of my team laughing as they prepare for another busy day. Sometimes I stand by the front window just to watch the first customers line up. It reminds me of how far I've come, but it also reminds me of what I lost to get here. One morning, while I was adjusting a vase of tulips near the entrance, I saw Daniel standing across the street. He looked older, worn, as if life had humbled him in ways pride never could. Our eyes met for just a moment and he crossed the street slowly. When he walked in, the entire restaurant fell quiet. He smiled awkwardly and said, "Mom, you've built something beautiful." I didn't know how to respond. For a second, I saw the same little boy who used to help me in the kitchen, who used to laugh every time I let him lick the frosting off a spoon. He said he wanted to talk. He said he wanted to talk. He told me he had seen the TV feature about my restaurant. He said he watched it 3 times, and every time he did, he felt both proud and ashamed. He said Olivia had been struggling, that things weren't the way they used to be, and that she wanted to apologize but didn't know how. I listened quietly. When he stopped talking, I simply said, "Daniel, I forgave you long before you asked. I wasn't doing it for you. I did it for me because carrying hate was heavier than any burden I've ever known." He reached for my hand, his eyes wet, and whispered, "I don't deserve you." I smiled softly and said, "Maybe not then, but maybe now you're trying, and that's enough." He left soon after, but something about that conversation stayed with me all day. I didn't realize how much peace forgiveness could bring until that moment. That night, when I closed the restaurant, I stayed back for a while. I walked through the empty dining room, hearing faint echoes of laughter from earlier. I thought about Olivia and wondered if she still remembered the words she once said to me, that my time was over. But now, standing in the heart of my own success, I realized those words had been my beginning, not my end. They had pushed me to rise higher than I ever thought I could. Later, as I locked up and stepped outside, the air was cool and soft. I could smell the faint scent of bread still lingering from the kitchen. I tilted my head up and looked at the glowing restaurant sign with my name on it. It didn't feel like a symbol of revenge anymore. It felt like closure, a quiet kind of justice that didn't need to hurt anyone to feel complete. I walked home that night with a lightness I hadn't felt in years. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't haunted by their laughter or their judgment. I was free. When I reached home, I turned on a small lamp by the window and sat down with my journal. I wrote about everything that had happened that day, about Daniel's visit, about the calm that had finally settled inside me. I wrote one last line before closing it, a line that felt like a promise to myself. I wrote, "Sometimes life doesn't give you revenge, it gives you redemption instead, and maybe that's even sweeter." I looked out the window at the city lights shimmering against the dark and smiled. My story wasn't just about pain anymore. It was about survival, about love, about finding strength when the world thought you had none left. And as I sat there watching the night fade into morning, I knew one thing for sure. My time was never over. It had just begun. The next morning, I woke up before the sun rose and the city was still half asleep. I could hear the faint hum of cars in the distance and the sound of rain brushing against my window. I sat up slowly, wrapped my shawl around my shoulders, and went to the kitchen to make my coffee. The smell filled the room, and for a moment, it took me back to the mornings when Daniel was little, when life felt simple and my heart was still unbroken. I stood there holding the warm cup between my hands, thinking about how everything had come full circle. There was peace in my life now, but there was also a kind of ache that came from remembering the things I had lost along the way. I got ready and walked to the restaurant early that morning. The streets were wet and my shoes made soft splashes as I walked. When I reached the door of my restaurant, the sign glowed faintly through the mist. Margaret's table, my name, my dream, my healing. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The smell of wood, herbs, and yesterday's baked bread greeted me like an old friend. I turned on the lights and let the soft glow spread through the dining room. Every table, every chair, every photo on the wall held a story. It wasn't just a restaurant. It was a piece of my soul built from everything I had endured. A few hours later, as the morning rush began, I noticed a familiar figure outside the glass door, Olivia. She stood there nervously, her hands clutching a small envelope. Her eyes looked tired, but her face carried something I hadn't seen before, humility. I walked over and opened the door. She looked up at me, uncertain, and said softly, I didn't want to come here, but I had to. I asked her to come in. She sat down quietly at one of the corner tables, the same spot where she once sat as a guest many months ago, never realizing I was the owner. She took a deep breath before speaking. She said that after their business collapsed, she tried to start again, but nothing worked. She said she had been so sure that money and power were everything, and in chasing that, she had lost everything that truly mattered. Her eyes filled with tears when she said she was sorry for how she treated me. She said she didn't deserve forgiveness, but she needed to say it out loud anyway. I listened silently. The pain in her voice was real. For a long time, I had imagined this moment, her apology, her regret, but standing there now, I didn't feel the satisfaction I once thought I would. I just felt human. I told her that when she mocked me years ago, her words had hurt deeply, but they had also woken something inside me. They had pushed me to build a life that no one could take away. I told her that forgiveness wasn't a gift for her. It was a release for me. She looked at me through tears and said she wished she had half the strength I had. I smiled and told her strength doesn't come from revenge. It comes from pain. She placed the envelope on the table and said it was the money she owed from the small loan Daniel had taken when they were struggling. I pushed it back toward her and said, keep it, start again. Her lips trembled. She said she didn't understand why I would help her after everything she did. I looked at her and said, because I know what it feels like to lose everything. And I would never want another woman to feel that kind of pain if I could stop it. She cried quietly, thanked me, and left the restaurant. I stood by the window and watched her walk away through the morning fog. There was no victory in that moment, only peace. I went back to work, helping the team prepare for lunch, greeting customers, smiling at faces I didn't know, but somehow loved. That afternoon, a group of students came in and asked if they could interview me for a project about women who reinvented their lives after 50. Their enthusiasm made me laugh. I told them my story, not the glamorous version, but the real one, the heartbreak, the betrayal, the loneliness, and the small, quiet moments that saved me. They listened with wide eyes, and when I finished, one of them said, "You're proof that it's never too late." Those words stayed with me for the rest of the day. When the restaurant finally closed that night, I walked outside and sat on the bench near the corner. The city lights shimmered and the air smelled like rain and roasted coffee. I thought about everything, the cruelty, the struggle, the revenge that had slowly turned into forgiveness. I had spent so much of my life thinking that being strong meant fighting back, but now I understood that real strength was being able to stand tall without hate in your heart. As I looked up at the glowing sign above my restaurant, I smiled softly to myself. My journey had begun with pain, but it had ended with peace. And in that moment, sitting there under the city lights, I knew one thing for certain. My revenge had never been about making them suffer. It had been about reclaiming myself. The woman they once mocked had rebuilt her world, and this time it was unshakable. The morning light slipped through my curtains, painting golden lines across the floor. And I lay there for a few minutes, just listening to the quiet hum of the city outside. A year had passed since my restaurant opened, and still each sunrise felt like a small miracle. I wasn't rushing anymore. I wasn't proving anything to anyone. I was simply living, breathing, and waking up with purpose. When I finally got up, I brewed my coffee the way I always did, strong, dark, and comforting. As I took the first sip, I looked out the window at the streets of Manhattan coming to life. Cars honking, vendors opening their stalls, people hurrying by with coffee cups in their hands. Once I had been one of those people lost in the noise, invisible, forgotten. Now the city seemed to nod back at me as if it knew I had earned my place here. When I arrived at the restaurant, the smell of freshly baked bread and herbs wrapped around me like an embrace. The staff was already setting up, laughing softly as they moved between tables. The morning light made the glassware sparkle, and I just stood there for a moment, taking it all in. This place was more than a restaurant. It was my redemption, my voice, my proof that broken women could rebuild their own empires. The sign above the door read Margaret's Table, but in my heart, it meant something more. It meant strength, second chances, and the quiet beauty of starting over. Around mid-morning, I was arranging fresh tulips near the counter when the door opened. A young woman stepped in, holding a folder and wearing a nervous smile. She looked barely 23. "Hi," she said softly. "I'm here for the cook position." I nodded and asked for her name. She smiled and said, "Olivia." The name hit me like a small wave. Not my Olivia, but hearing it still stirred something deep inside me. For a moment, I just looked at her, shy, unsure, eager to prove herself. She reminded me of myself when I first began, trembling with fear, but still holding on to hope. I told her to follow me to the kitchen. As we talked, I could sense her love for cooking, the same spark I once carried when no one believed in me. She said her dream was to cook food that made people feel something, that reminded them of love and home. Her words made me smile. I hired her that very day. As the weeks went by, she became part of our family. Watching her work brought back so many memories. I used to think revenge was my story, but now watching this young girl find her place in my kitchen, I realized my real story was about renewal. Every time I saw her smile after a successful dish, I saw a piece of myself healing. Life, in its quiet way, was showing me that kindness can sometimes complete the circle better than vengeance ever could. A few months later, we hosted an anniversary dinner for Margaret's Table. The place was packed, the lights warm and golden. My son, Daniel, was there too, sitting with his children near the front. He looked proud, truly proud, and that alone felt like a reward greater than any revenge. When I gave my short speech that night, I didn't talk about success or fame. I talked about resilience. I told the guests that sometimes the world breaks you so you can rebuild stronger, that sometimes the cruelest endings become the beginning of something beautiful. As I spoke, I caught Daniel's eyes glistening with tears. It was the first time in years I saw him look at me with the same love he had as a boy. Later that evening, as I walked around greeting guests, I noticed someone standing outside the restaurant's glass doors. It took me a moment to recognize her, but when I did, my heart paused. It was her, the real Olivia. She stood there quietly, dressed modestly, holding a small brown envelope in her hands. When our eyes met, she smiled faintly and motioned for me to step outside. The night air was cool. the city lights reflecting off the wet pavement. She handed me the envelope and said, "This is the money I owed you. But more than that, I wanted to say thank you." I looked at her, surprised. She continued, her voice trembling. "You didn't humiliate me when you could have. You didn't return cruelty with cruelty." I think about that every single day. You were right, Margaret. Kindness is the hardest kind of strength. Her eyes filled with tears. "I've started over. I'm working again. I just wanted you to know that your forgiveness changed me." For a moment, we just stood there, two women who had once been enemies, now bound by something much softer understanding. I placed my hand on hers and said, "You don't owe me anything, Olivia. Life has a way of teaching us lessons we didn't ask for. What matters is that you learned yours." She smiled through tears and whispered, "You did win, you know." I shook my head and said, "No, we both did." She hugged me before walking away, disappearing into the night crowd. And for the first time in years, I felt complete. When I returned inside, Daniel was waiting for me. He looked at my face and asked if I was all right. I told him I was more than all right. I was free. That night, after the guests had left and the lights were dimmed, I stayed alone in the restaurant. I walked from table to table, running my fingers over the polished wood, remembering every moment that had led me here, the nights I cried, the mornings I fought to believe again, the days I learned to stand tall, even when my heart ached. I realized then that revenge had never truly healed me. Forgiveness. The next morning, I opened the restaurant early. The sky was painted with soft orange and pink clouds. I brewed fresh coffee and sat by the window as the city slowly came to life. I thought about my journey, how it began with pain and humiliation and ended here in peace and grace. The woman who once cried in her kitchen was now the woman people came to for inspiration. Life has a strange way of rewriting our stories when we least expect it. By noon, the restaurant was full again. People laughing, the smell of food filling the air, the sound of plates clinking, and joy echoing from every corner. I watched Olivia, the young one, moving quickly between tables, her face glowing with pride. And suddenly I knew my purpose wasn't just to build a restaurant. It was to build people, to help others find their light the way I found mine. That evening, Daniel returned with his children again. The little ones ran to hug me, calling out grandma as their laughter filled the room. I looked at them, at my son, and I felt tears sting my eyes. Years ago, those same walls had heard my silence. Now they carried laughter, warmth, and love. When Daniel hugged me before leaving, he whispered, "You changed everything, Mom." I smiled and said softly, "No, son, life did. I just listened." After closing time, I sat outside the restaurant on the small bench near the corner. The night air was cool, brushing against my face. I looked up at the glowing sign above my restaurant, my name shining softly against the New York skyline. I thought about all the years I spent trying to prove my worth, all the pain that had shaped me, and all the people who had broken me without realizing they were only helping me grow. Revenge wasn't about winning against them anymore. It was about winning myself back. Sometimes I still hear Olivia's voice in my memory, the one that once said, "Your time is over." But now when I remember it, I smile because she was wrong. What? Because she was wrong. My time wasn't over. It had only just begun. I walked home that night under the city lights, my heart lighter than it had ever been. The streets were alive with energy, but inside me there was peace, real lasting peace. I thought about all the women out there, the ones watching, listening, living through their own heartbreaks and betrayals. I wanted to tell them all, if I could, that life doesn't end when someone tells you you're done. It begins the moment you decide to rise. When I reached home, I turned on a small lamp and sat by the window. I opened my journal and wrote the final line of my story. I wrote, "The sweetest revenge is rebuilding your life so beautifully that the ones who broke you no longer matter." I closed the book, placed it beside me, and looked out at the glowing city that once made me feel so small. Now it felt like mine. Thank you, my dear friends, for listening to my story. If you've ever been told you're too old, too late, or not enough, please remember this. You are still capable of miracles. You are still worthy of beginnings. Never let anyone make you believe your time has passed, because your story might just be starting. If my story touched your heart, please like the video, share it with someone who needs hope tonight, and don't forget to subscribe so you never miss another story. Until next time, take care of your heart, hold on to your dreams, and remember, your time is never over.